Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Critical race theory, a respected intellectual framework that has been around since the 1970s and is taught mostly in law school, is freaking out a lot of people. Most of those claiming to be outraged by critical race theory have no idea what they're talking about. And frankly, much of the Sturm und Drang is an exercise in bad faith, if not outright racism. We'll try to bring some clarity and honesty to the situation by speaking with Vincent Sutherland, an assistant professor of clinical law at NYU Law School, where he is the co-director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law. He is the co-editor of a new book that explores many of the themes covered by critical race theory. It's called Race, Rights, and Redemption. Professor, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start right at the beginning. Can you give us sort of a capsule definition of what critical race theory is?
Sure. So critical race theory actually at its core is a lens that helps us see the world for what it is. It helps us to understand that racism, and in particular, the ideology of white supremacy, is a real thing, that it has deep roots in American history, and that it casts a shadow not only over our past, but our present, and shapes our future. It interrogates the relationship between race, law, and power, and it forces us to ask the question, what does race have to do with it when we're thinking about and looking at a particular situation? It really seeks to account for the role of racism in the law, and ultimately pushes us to confront the hard truths that drive us to work towards securing freedom and an end to the subordination of all people based on race or identity.
Now, the book, and I'll give the title again because it's a terrific book. It's called Race, Rights, and Redemption, and you're the co-editor with Janet Deward-Bell, and she is the widow of Derek Bell. And the book consists of a series of lectures from the Derek Bell Lecture Series at NYU. And so, which leads me to the question, because I think everybody should know, but of course everybody doesn't know, who was Derek Bell?
Derek Bell was a legal scholar, an activist, an educator, a civil rights lawyer, and really one of the pioneers and intellectual fathers of critical race theory. He wrote path-breaking scholarship that I think today comprise some of the key and foundational pillars of critical race theory, namely that racism is a permanent and indestructible force, and that interest convergence really explains racial progress and retrenchment in this country. He began his career as a civil rights lawyer at the Department of Justice, and I think you'll see a pattern throughout his career that he takes these really significant stances on principle. So he started off as a lawyer at the DOJ in the Civil Rights Division. He was asked to relinquish his membership in NAACP because they said that would somehow taint his objectivity. And
that radical
right,
organization.
exactly. And this is in the 50s, and rather than resign his membership in the NAACP, he resigned from the Department of Justice. He then went on to join the Legal Defense Fund and handle a number of school desegregation cases throughout the American South. And following kind of a term at LDF, he began his career in academia. And that saw him spend some time at Harvard Law School as Dean of Oregon School of Law, and eventually spending the balance of his career at NYU School of Law. And at each stop along the way, he focused his teaching, his writing, and all of his energy on this relationship between race and the law. And also at each stop along the way, particularly at Oregon and at Harvard, he decided to step down from those positions and refuse to teach at those institutions until they would actually consider and hire candidates of color, and particularly women of color, onto their faculties. And so you see him kind of take these very significant stances throughout his career, courageous stances throughout his career, really to kind of bring to bear principles around racial justice into his own life.
Right. So now the term critical race theory is all over the place, and it's being used and in some cases grotesquely misused by people who really don't want any discussions of race or racism or racial justice or even diversity in the public schools. I mean, it goes so far that in many cases they don't even want straightforward accounts in history classes of slavery or the terror campaigns of the Ku Klux Klan, that sort of thing. How did this happen? I mean, how did critical race theory get in the crosshairs of these folks? And how do you suggest that people of goodwill respond to what's going on right now?
So, it's interesting how this all unfolded. It was really a targeted conservative campaign. And it came about kind of in the wake of, really at the tail end of a lot of the uprisings we saw in the summer of 2020, where you actually had a conservative activist who made it his central and sole agenda to focus his energy on this notion of critical race theory. And in doing so, really shunt into critical race theory all of the kind of grievances that we see so commonly held by those on the right and conservatives. And it really picked up steam when President Trump and the Trump administration issued an executive order in response to this conservative campaign, barring the types of teachings that we talk about that you just described, teaching responsive to thinking about our country's history around race and racial justice. And so that was really kind of where I think the campaign against critical race theory began, the backlash against critical race theory began, at least in recent years.
Right.
We're thinking about kind of people of good faith and what we should do in response to that. I think part of the challenge for all of us is to recapture this narrative and really force people to understand that critical race theory is not about blaming anybody or calling anybody a racist or saying that someone just because of who they are is a racist, but really forcing us to really confront our racial past and how that shapes the ways in which we live our lives today and how it will shape the ways in which we live our lives tomorrow. And the reality is we cannot overcome or address these problems without confronting them head on. And that's, I think, what critical race theory essentially forces us to do.
And I think an important point that we should make here is that a lot of the controversy surrounds people who are complaining about critical race theory allegedly being taught in the public schools and states passing laws to bar that. Can we be clear? Critical race theory, if I understand it correctly, is not taught in the public schools in the United States, is it?
No, it's not taught in the public school in the United States. So the critical race theory is a law school or graduate school course that students might take, but it's certainly not something that's taught in elementary schools, in high schools, right. and certainly not in the way that you see, people upset about it and kind of outraged about it being taught in these places. And I think beyond that, the reality is that if you ask the average person who's railing against critical race theory what it actually is, they wouldn't be able to give you any explanation for what it is. They would not be able to tell you. It wouldn't be able to tell you the first kind of thing about it. So it's kind of this. It's been weaponized and right. now is serving as a kind of container for all the types of racial grievances that I think are responsive to efforts to really confront racism in this country that have been ongoing for decades.
Right. So it is an important intellectual and legal framework. So I'd like to explore it a little bit so that we get a sense of what critical race theory really is, what it stands for, what its goals have been. Professor Bell contended that racism was a permanent and indestructible was a word that he used, component of life in the United States, and that is a cornerstone of critical race theory. That racism is baked into the institutions and the laws of the United States. Try to explain to us what that means and why critical race theorists believe this.
Sure. So what Professor Bell is describing when he talks about kind of the permanence of racism is he's actually looking back at our history and thinking about the ways in which racial inequality and racism have been in existence for centuries in this country. And so much of the ways in which America was built relied upon and rested upon racial inequality and this notion in these
Right.
notions of white superiority and white supremacy, right? And so history confirms kind of this idea that racism is woven into the fabric of our country. And I think you need look no further than all the kind of metrics that he looked at when he described and came up with this notion and really put this notion front and center with respect to the ways in which we think about critical race theory today. We think about along every metric, think about housing, education, employment, political power, the ways in which the criminal legal system operates. All these institutions and systems that govern our lives are all tainted by racial inequality.
Right.
Outcomes are worse for Black and brown people than they are for white people across the board. One very simple statistic: the average Black family would need 228 years to build the wealth of a white family today, right? That is not
assuming the white family was standing still.
Exactly. And that's not the result of Black people or Black families working any less hard, or white families working any harder than anyone else. All things being equal, that wealth gap is tremendous. It would take centuries to eradicate. And so when Professor Bell is talking about the permanence of racism, what he's really looking at are the very bare realities that we see in the world around us. I think it's troubling and difficult for people to understand that and accept that as a concept, because I think our standard and stock story that we tell ourselves in this country is that racism is a thing of the past,
Right.
or that racism is somehow less of a significant concern today than it was centuries ago. And of course, things have improved. Life has improved. Life has changed for the better for a number of people.
Without a doubt.
But I think one of the things that Professor Bell talks about and describes is that racism is a shapeshifter. That as we work to eradicate racism in one space, it moves to other spaces in our lives. And so I think it can be and can feel, I think, depressing in some ways. I think it can lead people to feel have some feelings of despair. But I think in Professor Bell's view, and I think in the view of many critical race theorists, it forces us to kind of confront hard truth and a reality, and really forces us to think more strategically and differently about the ways in which we might address the inequities that we see in the world around us.
And to acknowledge the reality of racism in our society, in the institutions, in the laws, in so much of American society, is not to say that all white people are racist, or that all white people should feel guilt over this or that. It's to acknowledge the reality of what's right before our eyes, or actually surrounding us. But I think that's, as you pointed out, that's very difficult for a lot of people to accept.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it is very, very difficult. And I think, I think we in this country, in America, we cling to this historical amnesia, right? We want to forget about our past because it is so very painful and difficult for us to grapple with. And I think it's true if you think about just your own personal life. Things that have happened in the past that are difficult, even if they've not happened to you directly,
right,
but are things that have happened in your family or your family lineage. Those are not things you want to revisit constantly. But the reality is that the trauma from those events lives within us and remains with us. And the only way to overcome and grapple with those challenges is actually to confront them. And I think that's what critical race theory at its fundamental level really forces us and asks us to do.
And God knows, an awful lot of Black people have wanted to get past it too. Have not wanted to think that racism is always with us. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and then the gains of the civil rights movement, an awful lot of people, including some leaders of the movement, thought that racism was on the way out, thought that most of it was behind us. And of course, and you wanted to believe that, but of course that was not the case. One of the key concepts of critical race theory developed by Professor Bell was the idea of interest convergence. Can you tell us what that's about?
Sure. So what Professor Bell is describing when he's talking about interest convergence is simply put that self-interest rather than some kind of moral awakening is really what yields racial progress. And so when we do see racial progress, it's because the interest of a dominant group is at play. And it's in that interest of that dominant group to actually advance the ball in terms of racial justice. When we see a retrenchment, when we see a backlash, it's because the interests of that dominant group is no longer in line with this notion of a need for racial progress. And so things kind of retrench and go back to the way they were. Sometimes, you think of history as taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Right.
It's like this kind of dialectic, this dynamic of advancing and then backlash, advancing and backlash. And when you describe kind of Brown versus Board of Education, the notion that racism was kind of on the way out, or at least the thought being that racism was on the way out. Brown was decided in 1954. And what Professor Bell, really kind of how he developed this theory of interest convergence, was actually looking at the Brown decision. Because I think at the time there was a sense that, the United States Supreme Court and those who were thinking about these issues actually had this great moral awakening and recognized and understood that racism is bad and segregation is deeply problematic. And what Professor Bell says is, yes, there may have been, in some sense, people understanding and recognizing that segregation is deeply problematic. But in another sense, at the time that Brown was decided, we were in the midst of a Cold War. And in that Cold War was really this effort to address the ways in which communist countries were vying for the kind of the support of emerging countries at the time.
Right.
And being able to point to the United States and saying, you United States export this ideal that all men are created equal, that everyone should be judged based on the content of the character rather than the color of their skin. And at the same time, you're segregating people by virtue of their race. And so what Professor Bell says is that America had this interest in promoting this idea of democracy and freedom and justice for all, in line with the notion of ending a regime of racial segregation. And so that's why the Brown decision came about. It wasn't really because of some great moral awakening, but really because of geopolitical pragmatism.
Right. The racism in the United States, some of the terrible things that were going on, the Emmett Till lynching, the legal segregation all over the South, and so much more, was actually interfering and harming American foreign policy in those days. The country felt it had to do something about it. So,
Exactly.
one of the questions that arises is critical race theory teaches that racism is a permanent aspect of life in the United States, permanent, and in Professor Bell's word, indestructible. Why would it not follow from that protests and resistance are futile? Because certainly Professor Bell did not behave as though it was futile to resist. And no one I know who has been a proponent of critical race theory believes that. Why is that not the case?
Right. So I think that's exactly right. Professor Bell, for him, resistance was an absolute necessity. And,
Right.
I think that when we think about this notion of why aren't protests, why isn't resistance futile, the reality is that the struggle itself, the agitation, the fight against racial injustice, that is what lets you know that not only you are alive, but that those who are seeking to oppress you and harm you have not won the day. And so, Professor Bell, when he talks about his notion of permanence of racism, he talks about in this article called Racial Realism, and he ends the article with a story about a case that he worked on in the efforts of one of the organizers in Mississippi to really try and enforce a court order to desegregate schools. And he talks about how this organizer, this older Black woman, didn't just agitate because she knew that she would win out. She didn't think that she would actually change people's minds or see success within the course of her lifetime. But she agitated because she knew that the fight itself, the protest, the struggle, the agitation, that's what let her know that she was alive, that she is here, that her life mattered. And it forced others to comprehend and understand what they were doing to her and what they were doing to her community.
Another aspect of critical race theory is that as you've mentioned, sometimes you do make progress in terms of racial justice, but another aspect of the theory is that racial progress is cyclical, that there's an ebb and flow, that whenever there is progress, almost inevitably there's a backlash. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So this is kind of central and really key to kind of this notion around interest convergence. And we see progress being made in moments where the interests align of those in the dominant group and people of color, Black and brown people. And then we see the backlash and retrenchment when those interests are no longer in alignment. And I think we saw that, we've seen that throughout history. So you think about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then the end of Reconstruction and the the era of lynchings and racial terror that followed that era. We saw it with the civil rights movement and the tremendous advances that were made, not only, starting with and thinking about Brown, but all the way up through the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And then following that era, the era of Reaganomics and the kind of conservative backlash and the rise of the conservative movement. Then we see it with we saw it with the election of Barack Obama and the 8 years that he was president, and the kind of immediate backlash with the rise of the Tea Party, eventually morphing into the election of Donald Trump as president. And I think we're seeing it now again in this country with, the movement that really has forced us to grapple with the ways in which police violence and has so very acutely harmed Black and brown communities. But not only that, but beyond that, thinking about the ways in which racial inequality has manifested itself across society in this uprisings over the course of the summer of 2020. And then the tremendous kind of response, the kind of orchestrated response we talked about earlier with respect to kind of pouring all the grievances and fears that come with the changing of society and the pointing out of some of these inequalities and injustices in the critical race theory and kind of the backlash that we see today. And so history is cyclical and it works in that way. And I think for us, when we think about what critical race theory teaches us and the ways in which we think about that lens, our task is really to work to see as many peaks of progress within our lifetime as we can and stem the tide of the backlash. But the backlash is inevitable in many ways, just because, as we described, history is cyclical.
And the backlash, I mean, it can take powerful and, in my view, move in an evil direction. I mean, when I think about the way the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when I think about the attack on voting rights that's going on all over the country right now, the assault on affirmative action. I mean, there is so much. I mean, it really does feel like we're going backwards now. And so when people talk about the cyclical aspect of progress, we're looking at sort of the backwards aspect of that those cycles.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and something, and something you just described there, kind of each one of those examples you gave are all, this is also kind of a part of critical race theory. This notion that law and courts are used as tools to kind of preserve the status quo, right? To preserve the structures of inequality, racial inequality that have so driven so many of the challenges that we see in the world around us. And so in each one of those instances, we've seen the law as protecting some of the more powerful interests that really will kind of further embed and entrench racial inequality in our society.
We have just 1 minute left, believe it or not, but I want to know, when you became a lawyer, why did you decide to focus so much of your efforts and your energies on racial justice? Why did you personally make that decision?
Well, so, it actually started long before I became a lawyer. When I was in about fourth grade, my family moved from a community that was largely Black and brown to one that was largely white. And my experiences there demonstrated to me very clearly the ways in which my race and identity shaped not only the world around me, but shaped my experiences and the way that people experienced me. And I decided right then and there that I wanted to do something about that. And as I came to learn more and more about our country's history, and the ways in which race and racial inequality had shaped so many experiences, we started to kind of gain a consciousness about the ways in which courts and law were complicit in that racial inequality. I couldn't help but want to get involved in this fight.
I, for one, am glad that you made the decision that you made. I'm also glad that you were willing to be with us today. Thank you so much. We've been talking with Vincent Sutherland of NYU Law School. And to our viewers, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.